Evelyn Pierce drove her elbow into frozen mud and wrenched the wagon wheel free with both hands alone in the dark and the cold, while her sister's laughter rang through the lit windows of their own house, where a wealthy rancher sat inside, deciding which Pierce woman was worth choosing. Nobody had thought to bring Evelyn in from the cold. Nobody had thought to introduce her. Nobody had thought about her at all. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe right now and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a comment below and tell me what city you're watching from, because I want to see exactly how far Evelyn's story travels. Stay with me all the way to the end, because what happens next is going to change how you see everything. Now, back to that frozen mud. Colton Mercer had ridden into Red Hollow, Wyoming on a dark bay gelding with trail dust on his coat and a very specific question on his mind. He had asked 3 people in town the same thing before he ever knocked on a door. He had asked who runs the most sensible household in this county. 3 people. 3 different answers about the same family. But every single one of them had talked about Madeline Pierce first. Madeline was 24. She had a face like a painting and a laugh that rearranged rooms. She wore her hair in careful curls, and her dresses were always pressed, and she knew exactly how to enter a space so that every head turned before she said a word. In Red Hollow, Madeline Pierce was considered the obvious answer to almost every question a wealthy man might ask. Evelyn was 31. She was Madeline's older sister. She was broader through the shoulders and fuller through the hips, with big, capable hands and dark circles under her eyes from a decade of holding a household together on a budget that had no business stretching as far as she made it stretch. She braided her hair back and out of the way because there was always something that needed doing, and hair in your face was a liability, not a decoration. People in Red Hollow knew Evelyn existed the way they knew a good fence existed. They were glad it was there. They never looked at it directly, and they never once considered who had built it. So when Colton Mercer rode up to the Pierce property that November evening and heard the party noise coming through the front windows, he followed a different sound around to the back. A grunt of effort. A heavy wet drag through frozen ground. The particular sound of someone working alone in the dark. He found Evelyn behind the house on one knee in the mud, resetting a wagon wheel by lantern light. She had her sleeves rolled to her elbows in the cold. She had the wheel seated on the hub, and she was testing the fit with one hand, spinning it, checking resistance, not satisfied yet. She found what she was looking for, picked up her mallet, and drove the pin home in 3 clean strikes. She stood, wiped her hands on the rag tucked into her belt, picked up the lantern, and then she saw him. She did not startle. She looked at him the way a woman looks at an unexpected man in the dark when she has long since stopped expecting men to be anything other than complications, steady measuring, giving nothing away. "You're blocking the gate," she said. Colton moved his horse 3 steps to the left without a word. "Thank you," she said, and walked past him toward the porch. He dismounted. "Ma'am, I'm looking for the Pierce household. You found it." She set the lantern on the porch railing and turned to look at him properly. He was tall, weathered in the way that meant years of outdoor work rather than years of easy living. He held his hat in both hands, and he was looking at her, not past her, not around her, directly at her, with the focused expression of a man doing serious accounting. "Go around front. There's a party. My sister's inside." "Your father's inside too, I expect," Colton said. "Harold Pierce. I wrote him 2 months back about a business arrangement. He told me to come in November." She went still. She knew about the letter. She had written most of her father's reply herself because Harold Pierce's hands shook when he held a pen now, and his eyes were failing, and he was too proud to say it plainly, but not too proud to let his older daughter handle what needed handling. She hadn't known the full particulars of the arrangement. Her father had given her enough to be useful, which was always exactly how much he gave her. "Come inside," she said. "I'll get my father." She did not offer to take his horse. He was a rancher. He could manage his own animal. He noticed that, filed it away. The Pierce house was warm and lit bright and smelled like apple cake and wood smoke. Madeline had arranged the furniture 2 days ago specifically for this evening, angling the good chairs toward the fireplace, placing the lamp so the light fell most favorably across the sitting area, the way a woman arranges a stage. She was holding court near the hearth with 3 young men from town positioned around her like moths that hadn't figured out yet they were going to get burned. She was laughing at something one of them had said, her head tilting at the precise angle that made her eyes catch the firelight, and she was the most beautiful thing in the room without appearing to try, which was its own kind of work that nobody ever credited. Their father, Harold Pierce, sat near the window. His glass of cider had gone warm in his hand. His eyes were somewhere else entirely. He focused when Evelyn crouched beside his chair. "Papa, Colton Mercer's here." Harold straightened. The vagueness cleared. "Mercer. Yes." He gripped the armrests and started to push himself up, and Evelyn was right there, one hand at his elbow, steady and quiet, not making anything of it. "Bring him in, Evie. Bring him in." She went back to the door. The moment. Colton Mercer stepped into the room. Madeline turned her head. She had the instincts of a woman who had spent years reading rooms, and she understood inside of 5 seconds that this man was different from the 3 already arranged around her. Older. Self-possessed in the way that doesn't bother announcing itself. He stood in the middle of the room, like he was deciding whether it was worth his time, and his eyes moved past her to Harold Pierce without stopping. Madeline was not accustomed to being moved past. She excused herself from her admirers with a bright smile and crossed the room with her hand extended. "Mr. Mercer, Madeline Pierce, I'm so glad you've come." "Miss Pierce." He shook her hand briefly, turned to Harold. "Mr. Pierce, good to meet you in person, sir." Madeline's smile stayed perfectly in place, but her eyes sharpened. Harold Pierce gripped Colton's hand with both of his. Sit down, sit down. Evie, bring coffee." Evelyn was already moving toward the kitchen. "Miss Pierce." She thought he meant Madeline. She didn't stop. "Ma'am." His voice had a particular quality, not loud, not sharp, but with a weight to it that cut through noise. "The other Miss Pierce, Evelyn." She stopped, turned. He was looking at her with that same direct accounting expression. "Sit down," he said. "This concerns you." The 3 young men near the fireplace looked at one another. Madeline looked at Colton, at Evelyn. The smile on her face did not waver, but something shifted behind it like a weather change behind glass. Evelyn pulled out a chair and sat. Harold Pierce cleared his throat. He looked at his hands for a moment, then at Colton, and seemed to make a decision about how much plain talking was called for. "Colton's been running Mercer Ridge without a woman's management for 3 years. Since his wife passed. He needs a partner, someone who understands a working operation." "You mean a wife," Evelyn said. "That's the directions I'm hoping things move," Colton said. He leaned forward slightly, both forearms on the table hat set aside. "But I don't move fast on things that matter. What I'm proposing first is a week. You come up to the ridge, see the operation, look at the books, talk to the hands, understand what I'm dealing with. Tell me honestly whether you think you can be useful there." "You're interviewing candidates," Evelyn said. "I'm trying to be honest about what I need, which is more than most men in my position bother with." He looked at her steadily. "I asked 3 people in town today who ran the best household in Red Hollow. All 3 of them started talking about your sister. But every single one of them, before they were finished, mentioned something that turned out to be your doing. The canning system in the root cellar. The arrangement with the Halverson boy for winter supply runs. The account books at the feed store that someone reorganized 2 years ago so the Pierce family stopped getting overcharged." He paused. "None of them knew your name when they described those things. They just said somebody smart did that." The room was completely quiet. Evelyn did not move. She was aware of Madeline standing at the edge of the room. She was aware of her father staring at his cider glass. She was aware that her heart was doing something unusual in her chest, and she was not going to let any of it show on her face. "My sister is better suited to," she began. "I'm not asking about your sister," Colton said. "Not unkind, not harsh, just exact the way a man is exact when he's done wasting time. I'm asking about you." Madeline set down her cup. It made a small, precise sound against the saucer. "I'll leave you to your business," she said, with the magnificent composure of a woman who has decided that if she stays in this room one more moment, she will say something she cannot take back. She walked down the hallway. The door to her room closed, It did not slam. That was worse somehow than if it had. Evelyn looked at the hallway for a moment. "You've just made this house very difficult for the next week," she said. "I expect I have," Colton said. "I'm sorry for that. I'm not sorry for being straight with you." She looked back at him. This man who had ridden in from the cold and looked past everything everyone had told him to look at and found her behind the house in the mud. She didn't know what to do with that. She had no practice with it. "I'll think on it," she said. "That's all I'm asking," he said. He meant it. He didn't press. He turned back to Harold and asked about the lower grazing patterns, and the conversation moved on. And what surprised Evelyn, what she kept turning over in her mind for hours afterward, was that she was included, not as a courtesy, not as an afterthought. He asked her questions and listened to the answers, and when she corrected her father's recollection of a price from the previous spring, he nodded and adjusted his figures without any indication that being corrected by a woman was something he found remarkable. It should not have felt remarkable. It did. The guests left over the next hour. The three young men departed with their confidence rearranged. Harold fell asleep in his chair, and Evelyn covered him with the good wool blanket and turned the lamps down. Colton Mercer took his leave at the door. "I'm at the Red Hollow Inn through the week," he said, settling his hat. "When you decide." "I'll send word," she said. He nodded once and walked out into the dark. She stood in the doorway and watched him go the wind off the mountain, cutting straight through her dress. Then she went inside and started banking the fire, and Madeline appeared from the hallway wearing her nightgown with her arms crossed and her beautiful face doing the complicated work of containing everything she was feeling. "He didn't look at me," Madeline said. "I mean, he looked. It wasn't Evelyn, he looked through me." "Maddie, I had Mrs. Hartley alter my blue dress for tonight. I spent 2 weeks deciding what to talk to him about." Her voice was steady, and that steadiness was its own kind of pain. "I wasn't being vain. I genuinely thought everyone said Papa said. I know what Papa said. Then how is this fair?" The steadiness cracked just slightly, just at the edges. "You weren't even in the room. You were outside in the mud, and he asked for you." Evelyn set down the fire iron. She looked at her sister, this woman who was genuinely beautiful, genuinely hurt, who had spent her whole life being told she was the answer and had built herself around that belief until she didn't know who she was without it. "I don't know that I'm going," she said. "But you're thinking about it." "Yes," Evelyn said. "I'm thinking about it." Madeline was quiet for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, almost to herself, "What does he see that everyone else doesn't?" Evelyn didn't answer. She didn't have one. She went to bed and lay awake listening to the wind and thinking about a ridge above the tree line where winters were mean and a man waited to see what she was made of. She thought about what it would mean to go. She thought about what it would mean to stay. She thought about her father's failing hands and her sister's wounded pride and the wagon wheel she'd reset in the dark, without anyone asking her to, without anyone noticing, without anyone thanking her. She thought, this is my whole life, doing the necessary thing in the dark. And then she thought, if just once I did the necessary thing in the light. She rose before the house the next morning and did not mention Colton Mercer's name. She made breakfast and checked the animals and mended a section of south fence and helped her father through his morning. She moved through her ordinary life with ordinary efficiency. But underneath the ordinary surface, something had shifted slightly off its usual angle. Some weight she'd carried so long she'd stopped noticing it had moved. On the second day, Mrs. Carolyn Whitmore stopped her outside the general store. "I heard about the Mercer man," Mrs. Whitmore said, tilting her head at the particular angle she used when she had information she wanted to appear reluctant to share. "I heard he came calling on your family." "We had supper," Evelyn said. "I heard Madeline made quite an impression." Evelyn looked at her. "Did you?" She walked into the store. Behind her she heard Mrs. Whitmore say something to whoever was standing nearby. She did not slow down. She bought what she came for and left by the side door and walked home through the cold with her basket and her thoughts. Red Hollow had already constructed its version of events, which bore a passing resemblance to what had actually happened, and a very precise resemblance to what the town needed to believe. Madeline had impressed the rancher. Madeline was being considered. Evelyn had been there too, of course, in her usual capacity, doing her usual things, being useful in her usual invisible way. Let them talk. They always talked. What changed everything was the note. It arrived on the third morning, tucked under the back door so quietly she almost missed it. Not from Colton. From a woman named Ruth Caldwell, who ran the laundry at the edge of town and had approximately zero patience for anything that wasn't true. The note said, "I worked Mercer Ridge 3 winters back. If you want to know what you're walking into, come see me this afternoon. R. Caldwell." Evelyn went. Ruth Caldwell poured coffee without asking whether she wanted any, sat down across the table, and spoke without preamble. "He's a hard man," Ruth said. "Not cruel, hard. There's a difference, and it matters. He runs a real operation, cattle hands, the whole thing, and he doesn't pretend it's something pretty." His wife understood that. Clara was her name. Practical woman. Could ride, could keep books, wasn't afraid of the mountain cold. Ruth wrapped both hands around her mug. "She died of a fever in the second winter. Hit him bad. He didn't show it except in work, just worked harder, which meant the hands worked harder, which meant they all got through. But 3 years is a long time to run a place alone." "What's he actually looking for?" Evelyn asked. "Someone who can look at a broke fence and figure out whether it needs to be fixed now or can wait till spring without being told which answer is the right one." Ruth looked at her steadily. "Someone who doesn't need the same thing explained twice. Someone who argues when she's right and admits it when she's wrong and doesn't make either one into a scene." A pause. "You want me to keep going, or have you heard enough?" "Keep going," Evelyn said. "His hands are loyal, which means they'll resist a new woman on principle until she earns it, and she'll have to earn it through work, not charm. The house is clean, but it's a working house, not a comfortable house. That's a difference too. The winters above the tree line are genuinely dangerous. Not romantic dangerous, but actually dangerous, and he'll expect whoever is beside him to understand that and act accordingly." Ruth set down her mug. "He's not a man who does things for appearance. He came here because he asked around and people kept pointing him toward this family, and then he looked past the obvious thing and found the true thing." "Why are you telling me this?" Evelyn asked. Ruth looked at her for a long moment. "Because you'll talk yourself out of it if nobody tells you the truth. And the truth is that everything that place needs, you've already been doing here for free without credit for 10 years. She picked up her coffee again. "That man is not doing you a favor by asking. You'd be doing him one by going." Evelyn sat with that. She walked home in the early dark with the cold settling in around her, and Ruth Caldwell's words sitting solid and unavoidable in her chest. She made supper. She checked the animals. She sat at the kitchen table after the house went quiet with a blank sheet of paper in front of her and the lamp burning low. She picked up the pen. She wrote Mr. Mercer, "I'll come for the week. E. Pierce." She sealed it. She set it by the door for morning. She spent the next 2 days getting the household ready for her absence. She wrote out a full set of instructions for Madeline, organized by day, by task, by priority. Knowing Madeline would follow perhaps half of them and improvise the rest, but establishing a structure that made the important things hard to miss. She arranged with the neighbor's boy to check on her father twice daily. She stacked enough wood for 2 weeks. She put the pantry in order. She checked every door, every latch, every loose board she'd been meaning to get to. On the morning of her leaving, Harold Pierce stopped her in the front hall. He took both her hands in his. His hands shook badly in the mornings. He held on anyway. "Evie," he said. She waited. I should have." He stopped, started again. "Your whole life. Everything I should have said." He looked at her with his failing eyes, and she could see him searching for words he had never learned to say, and was trying to say now at this late hour, in this cold hallway, before it was too late. "You're the best thing in this house. You always have been. I just—" His voice broke very slightly, pulled itself together. "Don't you dare go up that mountain deciding you're less than what you are. You hear me?" Evelyn held his hands carefully so the shaking wouldn't embarrass him. "I hear you, Papa," she said. She kissed his cheek. She picked up her bag. She walked out the door. She walked down the main street of Red Hollow with her bag and her back straight, and she did not look at Mrs. Whitmore's window, even though she could feel the curtain moving. She did not look at the young men loitering outside the feed store who stopped talking when she passed. She did not look at any of the faces she had lived among her whole life, the faces that had looked past her for 31 years, the faces that were now watching with open curiosity and the particular hungry interest of people who sense that something is happening that they don't yet understand. She looked forward. The road turned north toward the mountain. She followed it. The whole town watched her go. She never once looked back. The road north took 3 hours on horseback, and Evelyn spent most of it recalculating every decision that had led her here. Not with regret. She wasn't built for regret, but with the particular kind of cold-eyed assessment she applied to everything, the way she'd look at a household ledger that didn't balance and work backward through every line until she found where the error started. She was trying to find the error. She kept not finding one. That bothered her more than finding one would have. Colton rode beside her and did not try to fill the silence. She appreciated that more than she expected to. They were an hour into the ride before he spoke, and when he did, it wasn't small talk. It was a question. "What do you know about cattle operations?" "Enough," she said. "My father ran 30 head before his health turned. I managed the feed schedule and the rotation for the last 4 years. I know the difference between a sick animal and a lazy one. I know what bad water does to a herd before a veterinarian does, because I've seen it twice, and I paid attention both times." He nodded. No praise, no surprise. Just absorption the way a man files information he intends to use. "What don't you know?" he asked. She looked at him. Most men didn't ask that question. Most men were too invested in whether she was impressed with them to think of asking what she didn't know. "Large-scale rotation management," she said. "My father's operation was small enough that I could carry most of it in my head. Your numbers are different. I'd need to learn your system before I could improve it. That takes time." "How much time?" "Depends on how good your records are." "They're adequate," he said. "Then 2 weeks," she said. "Maybe less." He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked back at the road. "Clara would have said the same thing," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. "Almost exactly the same thing." She didn't ask who Clara was. She already knew from Ruth Caldwell, and she understood instinctively that this was not an invitation to press. It was the kind of thing a man says when grief surfaces without warning, when something small and ordinary catches on a memory and pulls. She let it be. That silence between them on that cold mountain road was the first honest thing they built together. The ranch appeared gradually, which was its own kind of statement about what kind of place it was. No sudden grand reveal. Just more and more evidence of serious work, the fence lines running clean and tight, the cattle in the lower field moving with the unhurried confidence of well-managed animals, the outbuildings solid and practical, nothing decorative, nothing wasted. The main house was big enough to be functional and no bigger. It had been built by someone who understood that shelter was the point, not impression. Evelyn looked at it and felt something she didn't immediately have a name for. It felt against all sense like something she recognized. The ranch hands were gathered near the main corral when they arrived. 5 men ranging from a boy of about 16 to a weathered figure in his late 50s, who introduced himself as Walt Greer, the foreman. Walt had the kind of that expressed opinions, whether its owner intended to or not. And what his face expressed when Colton introduced Evelyn was a careful, courteous skepticism. "Miss Pierce," he said, shaking her hand with the precise amount of pressure that communicated respect without commitment. "Mr. Greer," she said, "I understand you've been running this operation short-handed." Walt glanced at Colton. Colton said nothing, which was its own kind of response. "We manage," Walt said. "I'm sure you do," Evelyn said. "I'd like to look at the winter supply inventory before supper if you're willing, and the feed rotation schedule, and whatever you're using to track the herd count." Walt looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Colton again. Colton picked up his saddlebag from his horse and said without turning around, "Show her what she asks to see, Walt." Walt showed her. The supply inventory was in better shape than she'd expected, and worse shape than it should have been. The feed rotation was functional, but inefficient. She could see two places in the first 10 minutes where the schedule was creating extra work that a simple adjustment would eliminate. The herd count records were meticulous in some months and nearly absent in others, which meant whoever was keeping them had a good system that kept breaking down, which usually meant the system was too complicated to maintain under pressure. She didn't say any of this yet. She looked. She asked questions. She listened to Walt's answers with full attention because Walt knew things she didn't, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. At supper, Colton asked, "What did you find?" "Find problems," she said. "Fixable ones." Walt, who was eating at the far end of the table, looked up. "The feed rotation is costing you extra labor every third week," she said. "I can show you why after supper if you want. The supply inventory has a gap in the salt block accounting that's probably been there long enough that nobody notices it anymore. And whoever was keeping the herd count records was doing it correctly about 8 months out of 12, which means you don't actually know your accurate numbers for the other 4 months." The table was quiet. Walt set down his fork. "Those records go back 6 years, he said. "I've been keeping them myself for the last 3. "I know," she said. "The handwriting changes. Your months are consistently accurate. The gaps are from before you took over, and 2 of them are from last winter, which I'm guessing was a harder season than usual." Walt stared at her. "I'm not criticizing," she said. "I'm telling you what I see because Mr. Mercer asked. A gap in winter records during a hard season means someone was managing a crisis instead of paperwork, which is the correct priority. I just want to know the actual numbers going forward." Walt picked his fork back up. He chewed. He swallowed. He said grudgingly to the table in general, rather than to anyone in particular, "The salt block count's been bothering me for 2 seasons. "I figured," Evelyn said. "We can fix it tomorrow." Colton said nothing during this exchange. He ate his supper, but she caught the slight shift at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Something quieter than a smile. Something that looked like relief. That night, in the small room at the back of the house, that had clearly been prepared for a guest, but hadn't been used as one in some time. Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed and wrote 2 pages of notes by candlelight. Systems. Problem. Questions she still needed answers to. She worked with the focused efficiency of someone who understood that a week was not long, and she intended to see everything. She did not write down anything about the way Colton Mercer looked when he said Clara's name on the road. She went to sleep at 10 and woke at 5 and went to work. That second day was when Walt Greer began reluctantly to revise his opinion. It started with the horses. Evelyn was in the barn before any of the hands because she always moved through the early morning like she was the only person responsible for making it happen. She was checking the feed situation when she heard a horse in the far stall moving wrong. Not injured wrong. Anxious wrong. The particular kind of restless shifting that meant an animal was on the edge of something and hadn't been noticed yet. She went to the stall. The horse was a gray mare, young, probably just past 3, and she was running a slight fever and favoring her left front, and had the bright, uneasy eye of an animal that hurt and didn't understand why. Evelyn went in without hesitation, talking quietly. Her movements slow and deliberate, giving the horse time to register that she wasn't a threat before she was close enough to matter. She had her hands on the mare's left leg when Walt appeared in the barn doorway. "That horse," he started. "She doesn't. She's got heat in this leg," Evelyn said without looking up. "How long?" Walt came into the barn slowly. "I noticed she was off yesterday. Was going to have a proper look this morning." "Does she have a name?" "Della." "Della," Evelyn said to the horse. The mare's ear flicked toward her. "Okay, sweetheart. Let me see what we're dealing with." She worked through it carefully. It wasn't a break. It was a soft tissue strain, probably from the frozen ground, probably been building for longer than yesterday. She knew the treatment. She'd dealt with it before on her father's smaller operation, and the principles didn't change with scale. She told Walt what she needed. He got it without arguing. They worked on Della together for 40 minutes. When they were done, and the mare was settling, Walt leaned against the stall wall and looked at Evelyn with the expression of a man actively updating his understanding of a situation. You've done that before, he said. A few times, she said, checking Della's water. Most women who come up here. He stopped. Started differently. The last woman Mr. Mercer brought up to look at the place, 2 years back. She lasted one night, said the barn smelled. Evelyn looked at him. The barn smells like horses and hay and winter mud, she said. That's what barns smell like. Walt almost smiled. Yes, ma'am, he said. That's what I told her. By the third day, something had shifted in the ranch that Evelyn couldn't entirely account for. The hands had started nodding to her in the morning without being prompted. The youngest one, a boy named Pete, who couldn't have been more than 17, and who had been the most visibly suspicious of her arrival, had started appearing wherever she was working, not offering to help, but positioning himself close enough to watch the way young people position themselves when they're learning something and don't want to admit they're learning it. On the third evening, Colton found her in the supply room, reorganizing the salt block inventory. He stood in the doorway. You don't have to do this tonight, he said. I know, she said, not stopping. I want the numbers right before I look at the rest of the feed accounting. If the foundation's off, everything built on it is off. He came into the room and sat on a crate and watched her work for a moment. Walt says you handled Della better than most men he's worked with, he said. Walt is being generous. Walt is not generous, Colton said. Walt is precise. There's a difference. She almost smiled. Then I handled Della adequately. He said better than most men. She counted a stack, wrote the number, moved to the next. Della was scared and hurting, and she needed someone to be steady. That's not a skill. That's just paying attention. Colton was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Why did you stay in Red Hollow all those years? Running your father's house, looking after everything. You're clearly capable of more than that. Why didn't you leave? She stopped counting. She set her pencil down on the ledger and turned to look at him, because this question deserved a direct answer, and she wasn't going to give it to a wall. Because somebody had to, she said. My father couldn't manage alone. Madeline isn't built for managing. She's built for other things, and that's not a criticism, it's just true. Someone had to keep the household running, and the animals alive, and the accounts from going under. I was there, and I was capable, and so I did it. And if you hadn't been there, someone else would have done it worse, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. That's a hell of a reason to spend 10 years of your life. It was necessary, she said. I don't spend a lot of time resenting necessary things. It's not efficient. He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was something adjacent to it. Clara used to say something like that, he said. And this time, unlike on the road, he didn't pull back from the name. He let it sit there between them, present, but not raw. She used to say that there are things that need doing, and people who do them, and the people who do them are the ones worth knowing. Evelyn picked up her pencil. She sounds like she was a smart woman. The smartest I'd met, he said. Until recently. She wrote down the next number. Her handwriting was perfectly steady. She was proud of that. The fourth day brought the storm. It came in from the northwest with almost no warning. The way the worst mountain weather did a sky that was gray at noon and black by 3, and throwing horizontal snow by 4. Evelyn was in the far pasture with Pete checking on a section of fence the wind had been working on all week when the temperature dropped 10 degrees in 20 minutes and the snow started. Pete looked at the sky with the widened eyes of a boy who had not quite developed the instinct for when weather became danger. We need to get back, Evelyn said. The fence. We'll still be broken tomorrow, she said. Come on. They rode back through snow that was already accumulating and wind that wanted to push them sideways. Evelyn kept Pete in front of her where she could see him, which meant she took the worst of the wind at her back and arrived at the barn 20 minutes later, unable to feel her left hand, and not particularly concerned about it, because both horses were in and both riders were whole. Colton was in the barn when they came in. He took one look at Evelyn's hand and said, "Come inside." The horses need Walt's horses. Come inside. He said it the way a man says something he's not going to repeat, so she came inside. He wrapped her hand himself at the kitchen table with the focused practicality of someone who had dealt with cold injuries before and knew exactly what needed doing. His hands were large and rough and careful, and she sat across the table and watched him work and thought very deliberately about nothing at all, because thinking about something felt dangerous right now. "You put the boy in front," he said, not looking up from her hand. "He's 17, she said. "He's also been on this mountain 4 winters. He knows how to handle himself." "He knows it intellectually," she said. "He doesn't know it in his body yet. There's a difference. And until he knows it in his body, someone should be behind him." Colton looked up at her. She looked back at him. He went back to her hand. "You're going to be stubborn about things like this," he said. It wasn't a question. "I'm going to be right about things like this," she said. "Whether that reads as stubborn depends on whose perspective you're taking." He almost smiled again. She was starting to be able to see where the smiles lived in his face before they arrived, a slight softening at the corners of his eyes, a fractional change in his jaw. Most people probably missed it. She didn't miss things. That night, the storm kept everyone inside, and the whole operation shifted inward, hands playing cards in the bunkhouse, the fire in the main house burning high, the mountain howling outside in a way that made the walls feel important. Evelyn sat at the kitchen table with the ranch ledgers, 3 months of them, while Colton worked at the other end of the same table on a letter he seemed to be writing very slowly. At some point, she said without looking up, "Your timber revenue from the northeast section is being undercounted." He looked up. "What?" "Here." She turned the ledger and slid it toward him, pointing to a column. "Whoever is this timber is paying per board foot. But your measurement records are using a board foot calculation that runs about 12% low, which means you've been charging 12% less than you're owed for," she checked the date, "at least 2 years. He stared at the numbers. She watched the moment he saw it, the slight stiffening, the jaw setting. "I've been meeting with that buyer twice a year for 2 years, he said. "He probably knows," she said, not without sympathy. "That kind of error doesn't usually happen by accident on the buyer's side." "Harlan Voss," Colton said. Not to her. To himself in a tone that carried something cold and controlled underneath it. "You know him. He's been buying our timber for 6 years. A pause. "Longer than Clara was here." "Then Clara likely didn't catch it either," Evelyn said. "It's a subtle error. You'd only see it if you were looking at the measurement methodology specifically, not just the totals." "How much?" he said. She'd already calculated it. She turned the ledger back to the correct page and showed him the number. He was quiet for a long time. "2 years," he said. "At minimum. I'd need to go further back to know for certain." He stood up from the table and walked to the window and stood looking at the storm outside. His back was to her, but she could read the line of it. The controlled anger, the recalculation happening underneath the particular stillness of a man deciding what to do with information that changes things. "Colton," she said. He turned. It was the first time she'd used his given name. They both registered it. "This is fixable," she said. "You have the records. You have the calculation evidence. When the storm clears, you ride to Voss, and you lay it out, and he either corrects it going forward with back payment, or you find a different buyer, and you make certain every person in the timber business within 50 miles knows why you made the change." He looked at her steadily. "Which would you do?" he asked. "Both," she said. "I'd give him the opportunity to make it right because that's fair. And then if he didn't take it, I'd make sure everyone knew because that's also fair." He nodded slowly. Then he came back to the table and sat down and pulled the ledger toward him and began reading through it with the focused, unhurried attention of a man who had just discovered he needed to understand something completely. They worked at that table until midnight side by side, and not talking much, the storm outside and the fire inside and the ledgers spread between them, and it was the most natural thing Evelyn had felt in years. That was the 5th day's beginning, and everything that had been building quietly was about to break open. She was in the kitchen before dawn when Colton came in and sat at the table and said without preamble, "I need to tell you something." She set the coffee pot down and sat across from him. "I didn't come to Red Hollow looking for a wife," he said. She waited. "I mean, that's what I said. That's what I told your father. But that wasn't the whole truth of it." He looked at his hands on the table, those large, weathered, capable hands. I came because I've been running this place for 3 years, and it's still running, and the cattle are healthy, and the accounts are mostly right, and by every practical measure I should be satisfied." He paused. "And I wake up every morning in an empty house, and I go to bed every night in an empty house, and the practical measures don't. They're not enough. They haven't been enough for a long time." Evelyn said nothing. "I came because I was lonely," he said. "And that felt like a weak reason, and I dressed it up as a business arrangement because that felt more dignified. But you should know the real reason, because you've been honest with me since the moment I rode up to your gate, and you deserve the same." The kitchen was very quiet. The fire popped. Outside, the last of the storm was moving east. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "That's all. What else would you like me to say?" He looked at her. "I'd like to know how you feel about it. I think," she said slowly, "that lonely is not a weak reason. I think it might be the most honest reason a person can have. I think most people are looking for a business arrangement that turns out to be something else, and you're the first person I've met who was willing to say it in the right order." She looked at him directly. "I came up that mountain because I was tired of being invisible. Not because I was looking for someone to make me visible. I'd stopped waiting for that a long time ago. But because I wanted to see if I could choose something for myself, just once, without it being about what was necessary." I was very still. "And," he said quietly. "And," she said, "I think this place needs what I have. And I think—" She paused. And this was the honest part, the part she hadn't let herself say, even inside her own head. "I think I might need what this place is." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. She let him. They sat there in the early morning, in the kitchen of a hard place, above the tree line, with the storm gone and the light just beginning. And nobody said anything else for a while, because nothing else needed to be said yet. But Walt Greer, who had come in for his morning coffee and seen them through the kitchen window, before either of them saw him, turned quietly around and went back to the bunkhouse and told the hands that Miss Pierce was probably going to be staying. Pete, who was 17 and learning things in his body that he knew intellectually, said, "Is that good?" Walt poured his own coffee from the bunkhouse pot and thought about Della, the mare and the salt block inventory, and a woman who'd ridden behind a boy in a storm so the worst of the wind hit her instead of him. "Yeah," he said, "that's good." But what none of them knew, not Walt, not Pete, not Colton, at his kitchen table with his hand over hers, was that 60 miles south in Red Hollow, something had already been set in motion that was going to arrive at Mercer Ridge like weather, like the worst kind of weather, the kind that doesn't announce itself until it's already on top of you. The rider came from Red Hollow on a Tuesday, which was how Evelyn knew it was bad news. Nobody rode 60 miles in November cold on a Tuesday for good news. Good news waited for better weather. Bad news didn't wait for anything. She was in the supply room updating the corrected salt block figures when she heard the horse come in hard and fast. She heard Walt's voice outside, then a pause, then Walt's boots on the porch moving quickly. Walt did not move quickly unless something required it. He knocked on the supply room doorframe. "Miss Pierce, rider from town, says he's got a letter for you, personal." She set down her pencil and went outside. The rider was a boy she recognized, Tommy Alcott, 16, who ran errands for the Red Hollow post office when the weather was clear and apparently when it wasn't. His horse was blowing hard, and he looked cold down to his bones. He held out a folded letter with her name written on the outside in handwriting she recognized immediately. Madeline's handwriting, but tighter than usual, pressed harder into the paper. She gave Tommy money and told Walt to get him something hot and dry before he rode back, and she took the letter inside and opened it at the kitchen table. She read it once quickly. Then she sat very still and read it again slowly. Madeline had written 4 sentences. "Papa collapsed 2 nights ago. Dr. Hines says his heart is weak and he needs full rest and someone to manage everything. I have been trying, but Evelyn, I don't know how to do what you do. Please come home." Evelyn was on her horse within the hour. She didn't let herself think too hard about what she was leaving. She didn't let herself think about the kitchen table that morning. Colton's hand over hers, the light coming through the window, the thing that had been beginning to build between them. She thought about her father's shaking hands. She thought about Madeline's letter, those 4 sentences that contained inside them the entire weight of everything Madeline had never learned, because Evelyn had always been there to do it first. Colton found her in the barn, saddling her horse. He stood in the doorway and looked at her the way he looked at problems directly, completely without flinching from what he saw. "Your father," he said. It wasn't a question. Walt would have told him. "He collapsed," she said, tightening the girth strap. "His heart." "How bad?" "I don't know yet. Bad enough that Madeline wrote 4 sentences instead of 4 pages, which means she's genuinely scared." He was quiet for a moment. "I'll ride with you," he said. She stopped and looked at him. "You have a ranch to run." "Walt can manage 4 days." "Colton. Evelyn." He said her name the way she'd said his that night at the kitchen table, as a complete sentence, as a thing that settled something. "Your father is sick. You're not riding 60 miles alone in November." She looked at him for a long moment. The part of her that had spent 31 years managing everything alone wanted to say she was fine. She didn't need company. She'd ridden alone before. The part of her that was learning slowly, and with some resistance, to let someone stand beside her instead of behind her, that part closed its mouth and nodded. They rode hard and made Red Hollow before dark. Harold Pierce was in his bed, which told Evelyn everything, before Dr. Hines said a word, because in 20 years of illness and pain and difficult mornings, her father had never willingly stayed in bed past 7 o'clock. He was smaller than she remembered. That happened sometimes when you were away from someone. The daily accumulation of small changes that you stopped noticing when you saw them every day became suddenly visible all at once when you came back. He opened his eyes when she came into the room. "Evie," he said. His voice was thinner than it had been 2 weeks ago. "I'm here, Papa," she said, and sat beside him and took his hand. "The animals. I'll check them tonight." The south fence had a loose post. "I know. I'll get to it. I told Madeline about the root cellar supply, but she—" "Papa." She squeezed his hand gently. "I'm here. Stop worrying." He closed his eyes. His hand tightened on hers for a moment. Then the tension went out of it, and he slept. Evelyn sat with him until she was sure the sleep was real and not something else. Then she went downstairs. Madeline was in the kitchen. She had clearly been trying. The evidence was everywhere in the slightly wrong arrangement of the pots, the fire that was burning too hot, the bread that had been baked with determination and insufficient skill. She looked at Evelyn when she came in with an expression that was equal parts relief and shame, and something else that Evelyn needed a moment to identify. Gratitude. Real gratitude. Not the performed kind. "You came," Madeline said. "Of course I came," Evelyn said. "I didn't know." Madeline stopped. "I didn't know he was this bad. I thought he had more time to get better." "He's been getting worse for 2 years," Evelyn said, not unkindly. "I didn't tell you because there wasn't anything to tell. It was slow. It's been slow." Madeline sat down at the kitchen table. She put both hands flat on the surface, looking at them. "I've been doing it wrong," she said. "Everything. I've been following your instructions, but I've been doing them wrong, and I know I have been, and I couldn't figure out how to ask because—" She stopped. "Because asking felt like admitting you couldn't do it," Evelyn said. "Yes." Evelyn sat across from her. "Maddie, I couldn't do it either the first time. I learned by doing it wrong and then figuring out what right looked like." Madeline looked up. "You never seemed like you were doing it wrong." "Because by the time you were old enough to notice, I'd already done it wrong enough times to know how to hide it." She paused. "That's not the same as being naturally capable. That's practice." Madeline was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He's outside." "I know. Is it serious between you and—" "It's early," Evelyn said. "But there's something." She looked at her sister. "Yes," she said. "There's something." Madeline nodded slowly. She looked at her hands again. "He really didn't see me," she said. "Not like I'm not saying it to be difficult. I just genuinely could not understand it. I am accustomed to being seen." "I know. And I've been thinking about that." Madeline's voice was careful, like she was carrying something fragile. About why it bothered me so much. And I think... She stopped, started again. I think I've been trying to be chosen my whole life, and I've always been chosen. And I never thought about what happens after being chosen. What you're supposed to do once someone picks you. She looked at Evelyn. You've never tried to be chosen, have you? Evelyn was quiet for a moment. No, she said. I gave up on that a long time ago. And somehow that's what made him choose you. I don't think that's why, Evelyn said. I think he chose me because he needed someone capable of standing next to him. Not someone who needed him to tell her she was valuable. Madeline was quiet for a long time after that. When Colton came in from seeing to the horses, Evelyn was already deep in the work of reassessing everything. The food stores, the animal situation, her father's medication schedule, the list of things that had slipped in the 2 weeks she'd been gone. Colton took one look at the organized chaos of the kitchen and sat down without being asked and said, "Tell me what you need," she told him. He did it. No performance, no commentary. Just a man making himself useful in a situation that needed useful things. Madeline watched this from the doorway of the kitchen and said nothing. But something in her expression had shifted. Something thoughtful and almost painful, the look of someone revising a long-held understanding. Dr. Hines came by the next morning. How was a compact, serious man who delivered information. The way Evelyn preferred information, delivered plainly, without the softening that turned into imprecision. He sat at Harold's bedside with Evelyn in the chair across from him and said, "His heart is working too hard for too little return. He needs rest, genuine rest, not the kind where a man lies in bed and worries about his fence posts. He needs someone managing the household completely, so he has nothing to manage. He needs specific diet adjustments, and I'll write those down. He could have years left if he treats this correctly." A pause. He could have considerably fewer if he doesn't. "He'll treat it correctly," Evelyn said. "He'll need to want to," the doctor said. "Men like your father are difficult patients. They don't like being looked after." "I know," she said. "I've been looking after him for 10 years. Dr. Hines looked at her over his glasses. "Then you know what I mean," he said. "You'll have to be firm with him, firmer than feels comfortable." "I've had practice," she said, after the doctor left. Evelyn sat in the hallway outside her father's room and let herself be still for 3 minutes. Just 3 minutes. That was all she could afford. She thought about Mercer Ridge. She thought about the ledgers spread across that kitchen table, the corrected timber calculations, the salt block inventory that finally balanced. She thought about Della the mare with the strained leg, the storm that had come in fast from the northwest, Pete's wide eyes when the temperature dropped. She thought about a hand over hers on a kitchen table and the first morning light coming through the window. She thought about what she had been beginning to build up there. And then she put it down carefully, the way she put down heavy things when she needed both hands for something else, and she stood up and went back to work. Colton found her that evening, mending the loose post on the south fence in the near dark, using the same lantern she'd used the night he arrived. He stood on the other side of the fence and watched her set the post with the focused familiarity of a man who has learned not to offer help she hasn't asked for. "You're going to stay," he said. She drove a nail and didn't answer immediately. "My father needs someone here," she said. "And Madeline." "Madeline is 24 years old," he said. "She is capable of learning." "She is," Evelyn said. "But she hasn't learned yet, and he can't wait for the learning curve. So that's it," he said, not angry, just looking at the thing directly the way he looked at everything. "You came off the mountain, and now you're back to where you were." "That's not..." She stopped, set down the hammer, turned to face him properly over the fence. "It's not the same. I'm not staying because there's no other option. I'm staying because my father is sick, and my sister genuinely needs help, and those things are real, and they matter." "I know they're real," he said. "I'm not arguing they're not real." He looked at her steadily. "I'm asking if those things are the only reason." She held his gaze. "I'm scared," she said, which was not the kind of thing she said easily or often. "I'm scared of what's up on that mountain. Not the work I can do. The other part. The part at the kitchen table that morning. Why? He said. Because I don't know how to trust it, she said. I've spent 31 years being invisible, and I've made my peace with that, or I thought I had, and then you showed up and looked at me like I mattered. And I don't know what to do with that. I don't have practice with it. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he walked around the fence to her side and stood in front of her close enough that she had to look up slightly to meet his eyes. I'm not going anywhere, he said. I'll come back every 2 weeks. I'll make sure your father has what he needs from the ranch. We can work out the supply lines, the winter provisions, whatever he's short on. He paused. And I'll court you properly, the way a man is supposed to, not a week's audition on a mountain, properly. She stared at him. You'd ride 60 miles every 2 weeks. I'd ride considerably more than that, he said, for considerably less return. She felt something crack open in her chest that had been closed for a very long time. That's... She stopped, tried again. That's not a practical arrangement. No, he agreed. It's not practical at all. She almost laughed, something close to it, something that felt in its own way like the beginning of laughing. All right, she said. All right, he said. They stood there in the dark, with the lantern between them, and neither of them said anything more, because neither of them needed to. What happened 3 days later was something neither of them had seen coming. It came in the form of a man named Gerald Whitfield, who arrived at the Pierce house on a Thursday morning with a leather satchel and a pair of expensive boots that had never once been in actual mud, and a smile that was doing a great deal of work covering a great deal of something else. He asked for Harold Pierce. Evelyn told him Harold Pierce was resting and not available for visitors. He handed her a card. It read, Gerald Whitfield Land and Property Acquisitions, Denver, Colorado. I only need a few minutes, he said pleasantly. It's a business matter. Quite favorable to your family, I think you'll find. She looked at the card. She looked at him. She did not particularly like what she saw, and she had learned over the years to take that instinct seriously. My father isn't well, she said. Any business matter can be addressed through correspondence. Of course, he said, still pleasant, still smiling. Though these things tend to benefit from a face-to-face conversation, particularly when time is a factor. Time, she said. There are other interested parties, he said. Other landowners in the area your father might know. Your family's property sits at a particularly strategic point, Miss Pierce. Multiple buyers have expressed interest. I'm here because my client's offer is the most generous, and I'd hate for your family to miss that window by waiting too long. She stood in the doorway and held his gaze and felt the specific chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. I'll tell my father you called, she said, and closed the door. She stood in the front hall with Whitfield's card in her hand and thought. Then she went to find Colton, who was in the barn with Walt. Colton had brought Walt along on this visit, partly for the extra pair of hands and partly because Walt had turned out to be useful in ways that extended beyond the ranch itself. She told them both what Whitfield had said word for word, the way she repeated things precisely without editorial. Colton's expression didn't change, but his jaw set. Strategic point, he said. That's what he said. Do you know what's strategic about your father's property? He asked. The water rights, Walt said before Evelyn could answer. Both of them looked at him. He shrugged. I grew up 30 miles from here. The Pierce land borders the east fork of the Callaway Creek. That's the main tributary feeding into the lower valley grazing land. Whoever controls that water controls where cattle can run for 20 miles in any direction. Evelyn had not known this. She should have known it. She went back over it in her mind, the eastern fence line, the creek, the way certain neighbors had always been particularly interested in maintaining good relations with her father, even when those relations didn't seem to serve any obvious purpose. She went back over it and felt the particular cold fury of someone who realizes they've been managing something for years without understanding its full value. Whitfield's client, Colton said. Did he say who? He did not. He wouldn't, Walt said. Not first visit. Colton looked at Evelyn. I need you to think carefully, he said. In the last year, anyone who's approached your father about the land. Anyone who's been particularly friendly when they had no particular reason to be. She thought. The name came to her in pieces, the way true things sometimes did, not all at once, but in accumulation, one detail pulling another until the shape was clear. Harlan Voss, she said. Colton went very still. He came to supper twice last spring, she said, speaking slowly, following the thread. He said he was expanding his timber business and was interested in establishing better relationships with neighboring landowners. My father thought he was just being sociable. I thought... She stopped. I thought it was a little deliberate, but I didn't know what he wanted, so I couldn't name it. You know what he wants now, Colton said. The water rights, she said. And the timber on the eastern section. She looked at him. He's been undercounting your timber revenue for 2 years. He's been cultivating my father. And now he's sent someone here with a satchel and a smile. That's a lot of connected lines, Walt said carefully. Yes, Evelyn said. It is. Colton stood up from the crate he'd been sitting on. He had that stillness that she'd learned was the most focused version of him. Not the stillness of inaction, but the stillness of a man who had made a decision and was now simply working out the sequence. We need your father's land records, he said. Every deed, every survey, every water rights document he has, tonight. I know where they are, she said. He keeps them in the locked box under the bed. I've had the spare key since he got sick. Good. He looked at her. Evelyn, this is bigger than Whitfield. Voss has money, and he has patience, and he's been planning this longer than we've known about it. Your father's property is not the only piece he's after. It's the piece that makes the other pieces work. What other pieces? She said. I'm guessing, he said. Mercer Ridge borders the North Fork of the same system. If Voss controls the East Fork through your father's land and the North Fork through mine or through what used to be mine. He stopped. She understood immediately. He's not just after water rights. He's building a monopoly on water access for the entire valley system, which would let him set the terms for every cattle operation in the region, Walt said. His voice had gone flat and hard. Every rancher within 40 miles would either pay Voss's price or move their cattle. The three of them stood in the barn and let that sit for a moment. How long has he been working on this? Evelyn said. Long enough, Colton said. Long enough that he was patient about the timber money, because that wasn't the real play. The timber was just a way to keep a relationship going. The real play is the water. She took the key from the cord around her neck where she kept it. I'll get the documents, she said. She went upstairs and eased open her father's door. He was sleeping, thank God. She knelt beside his bed and pulled out the locked box without waking him and took it to the kitchen table. Inside she found everything she'd hoped, and one thing she hadn't. The deed. The water rights survey dated 1871, clear and complete. The property boundary documents. All of it in order, all of it legitimate, all of it exactly what she'd expected. And then beneath everything else, a folded letter she had not known existed. She opened it. It was dated 6 weeks ago. It was from Harlan Voss. It was addressed to Harold Pierce. And it began, as we discussed during my visit in September, the arrangement I'm proposing would relieve your family of significant financial burden while ensuring the long-term security of the property under new management. Her hands were completely steady as she read it. Her heart was not. Because the letter described in pleasant, careful language a deal that had apparently already been discussed. A deal in which Harold Pierce, without telling either of his daughters, had been in conversation with Harlan Voss about the possibility of selling the water rights. Not the land, just the rights. But the rights were everything. She read the letter 3 times. Then she folded it, put it in her pocket, locked the box, replaced it under her father's bed, and went back downstairs. Colton looked at her face when she came into the kitchen and said, "What did you find?" She put the letter on the table. He read it. Walt read it over his shoulder. The kitchen was very quiet. "He didn't tell you," Colton said. "No," she said. "How far along is this?" "Far enough that Voss felt comfortable sending Whitfield directly," she said. "Far enough that my father received this letter and kept it." She paused. "Far enough that I need to ask my father why." She didn't want to ask her father why. Her father was sick, and the doctor had said he needed rest, and no worry. And Evelyn was very much aware that what she was about to do was the opposite of rest and no worry. She was also very much aware that she had no choice. Because if Voss got those water rights, it wasn't just the Pierce family that would pay for it. She went upstairs. Harold Pierce woke up when she sat in the chair beside his bed. He blinked at her, at the expression on her face, and he knew. The way people who have been found out always know before a word is said, something going out of them, some held tension releasing in the wrong direction. "Evie," he said. "I found the letter, Papa," she said. He closed his eyes. "Tell me," she said. "Tell me all of it." He told her. The debt had been building for 3 years. Not catastrophically, Harold Pierce was not a reckless man. But the medical costs had been steady and significant, and the household running costs had quietly exceeded income in a way that Evelyn hadn't seen in the books, because her father had been managing a separate account. She didn't know about paying the doctor and the medication out of a small savings that had now almost entirely disappeared. He hadn't told her because he was ashamed. He hadn't told her because she was already carrying everything, and he couldn't make himself add this. Voss had found out. Evelyn did not ask how a man like Voss made it his business to know which landowners were underwater, because underwater landowners were motivated sellers. He had come to Harold with an offer that was framed as a solution. Not a takeover, just a simple transaction. The water rights in exchange for enough money to clear the debt and provide 3 years of financial stability for the family. Harold had been considering it. "I was going to tell you," he said. "I was trying to find the right way." "The right way," she said. "I know," he said. "I know, Evie. I couldn't stand it. You've done everything, your whole life. I couldn't stand to tell you that I'd let it come to this." She sat beside his bed and looked at her father. This man, she had organized her entire adult life around this man who had failed her in 100 small ways and loved her in the imperfect, insufficient way that people love each other when they don't have the language for it. And she made a decision. She was not going to be angry. Not right now. Not with him lying there with his failing heart and his shame and his eyes that couldn't quite meet hers. "Papa," she said, "I need you to trust me." "I do trust you," he said. "Then trust me with this." She leaned forward. "You don't sign anything. You don't speak to Whitfield. You don't respond to Voss. You let me and Colton Mercer handle this." She paused. "Can you do that?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Mercer's a good man," he said finally. "I know he is," she said. "He came back with you," Harold said. "Rode 60 miles in November to be here." He looked at her with the tired eyes of a man who had been watching his daughter carry too much for too long and had never found the right words for what he saw. "He sees you, Evie. That man sees you the way you're supposed to be seen." She pressed her lips together. "Don't let that go," he said. "Whatever else happens, don't let that go." She took his hand. She held it until he fell back asleep. Then she went downstairs and told Colton everything. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she'd come to understand about him. He listened to the end before he responded, because he was building the complete picture before he decided anything. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Voss made 3 mistakes," he said. 3, Walt said. He underestimated how long the timber accounting would stay hidden. He approached Harold directly instead of waiting until the man was in genuine crisis. And he sent Whitfield today before the deal was signed, which means he's nervous about timing. Colton looked at Evelyn. "A nervous man moves fast. A man moving fast makes errors. We need to move faster." "The water rights documents are solid," she said. "Nothing can be signed without my father's willing agreement and his signature. He's agreed not to sign anything." "Voss doesn't know that yet," Colton said. "Which means we have time, but not much." "What do we do with what we have?" Walt asked. Colton looked at Evelyn. She already knew the answer. She'd been building it since she read the letter. "We go to the other ranchers," she said. "The ones who'd be affected by Voss controlling the water rights. We show them the timber accounting, the undercounting, the methodology as proof that Voss operates by taking what isn't his when he thinks nobody is looking. She spread her hands on the table. We let them understand what happens if he gets the water. And then we show up at his door with enough people standing behind us that he understands his window is closed. The kitchen was very quiet. Walt looked at Colton. Colton looked at Evelyn. How many ranchers are we talking about? Walt said. 6 families I can name in the next 5 minutes, she said. Probably more if we ask the right people. You know these people, Colton said. I've been managing this household for 10 years, she said. I know every family in this valley. I know their names, their finances, their disputes, their loyalties, and what they had for dinner at the Harvest Social 3 years running. Walt made a sound that was almost a laugh. Colton looked at her steadily. Then he said, Tell me where to start. And for the first time in her life, Evelyn Pierce sat at a table with 2 men who were not asking her to step aside or to simplify or to make the thing smaller than it was, and she told them exactly where to start. They started with Frank Dolan. Colton knew him from cattle business. A square, plain-spoken man who ran 300 head in the lower valley and had the reputation of someone who said exactly what he meant and meant exactly what he said, which made him either very easy or very difficult to deal with, depending on what you needed from him. Colton trusted him. That was enough for Evelyn. They rode to the Dolan place. The next morning, Colton and Evelyn and Walt and Frank Dolan came out to meet them in his yard, with the careful expression of a man who reads visitors before they dismount. Mercer, he said. Then he looked at Evelyn. Miss Pierce. Mr. Dolan, Evelyn said. We need 20 minutes of your time. It's about your water access. Frank Dolan's expression changed. Not dramatically. Just a slight sharpening around the eyes, the particular alertness of a man who has been quietly worried about something and just heard someone else say it out loud. Come inside, he said. They laid it out at his kitchen table. The water rights geography, the East Fork, the North Fork, the tributary system that fed every grazing operation in the lower valley. The timber accounting discrepancy with the actual figures, the actual methodology, the actual numbers that demonstrated how Harlan Voss operated when he believed he wasn't being watched. The letter to Harold Pierce, which Evelyn had brought in her coat pocket, which she set on the table and let Frank read in silence. Frank read it twice. He set it down. He looked at the wall for a moment. How close is he to getting it? Frank said. Close enough that he sent someone to the Pierce house 3 days ago, Colton said. We stopped it, but he'll try again. And if he gets the East Fork water rights, Frank said, combined with what's on the north side. Mercer Ridge borders the North Fork, Colton said, which Voss has also approached me about, twice in the form of timber partnership proposals. I didn't understand what he was building toward until Evelyn found the letter. Frank looked at Evelyn. You figured this out. I found the letter, she said. Colton understood the geography. Walt knew the water system, between the 3 of us. Frank nodded slowly. It was the nod of a man recalibrating. My east pasture runs right along the Callaway Creek lower branch, he said. If someone controls the upper rights, they control my access. I've always known that theoretically. I just never thought anyone would actually try. Voss is patient, Walt said. He's been working on this for at least 2 years that we can document, probably longer. Who else does he approach? Frank said. That's why we're here, Evelyn said. We need to know who else has been contacted, who else has received visits from men with leather satchels and expensive boots who talk about favorable arrangements. Frank was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Jim Calloway. About 6 months back. A man came out to his place. Jim mentioned it at the feed store, said some Denver buyer was interested in his east section. Jim thought it was just land speculation, didn't think much of it. Jim Calloway's east section, Walt said. That borders the creek tributary feeding the South Range, Frank said. Yes. He stood up from the table. I'll get my horse. You don't have to, Colton started. I've known Jim Calloway for 20 years, Frank said, already pulling on his coat. He'll listen to me faster than he'll listen to strangers. No offense. None taken, Evelyn said. There were 4 of them riding to the Calloway place, and 6 of them riding to the Hendersons after that, and by the time the sun was directly overhead, they had collected 8 ranchers in Frank Dolan's barn, sitting on crates and upturned buckets, and one good chair that Frank had brought out for Harold Pierce's daughter without making a thing of it. Evelyn stood in front of them and laid it out. Not with drama, with numbers, with documents, with the timber accounting spread across a board so every man in that barn could see exactly what Harlan Voss had been doing to Colton Mercer's operation for 2 years and understand precisely what that implied about what he would do to all of them, given the opportunity. The barn was very quiet while she talked. When she finished, a man named Hector Reyes, who ran cattle on the western slope, and had the particular stillness of someone who makes decisions carefully and completely, before speaking said, "What do you propose?" "3 things, Evelyn said. "First, every man here who has been approached by Whitfield, or by anyone representing Voss, stops all communication immediately and puts nothing in writing without legal review. Second, we document every approach, every visit, every letter, every conversation, and we compile it together, because individually, these look like routine business inquiries, and collectively, they look like a coordinated scheme." She paused. "Third, we go to Voss directly, all of us, together, and we make it clear to him that his window is closed and the cost of pressing further is considerably higher than anything he stands to gain." The men looked at each other. Frank Dolan said, "Before he can send Whitfield back to my father," Evelyn said, "which means within the week." Another quiet moment. Then Hector Reyes said, "I'm in." And that was the one that mattered, because 3 other men immediately said the same thing, and the remaining 2 took about 30 seconds longer and then said it too. 8 families, 8 operations, 8 sets of water rights that Voss needed to make his plan work, and all 8 of them now sitting in Frank Dolan's barn, understanding exactly what that plan was. Colton caught Evelyn's eye across the barn. She looked away before he could make it into something. There was still too much to do. What she did not account for riding back to the Pierce house that evening was Madeline. Madeline was waiting on the front porch when they rode in. She had her coat on and her arms crossed, and an expression that Evelyn had not seen on her sister's face in a very long time, focused and serious and stripped of the performance that Madeline usually wore the way other women wore jewelry. "Whitfield came back," Madeline said. Evelyn was off her horse before the word back was finished. "What did you tell him?" "Nothing. I told him Papa was sleeping, and we weren't receiving visitors." Madeline's chin came up slightly. "I told him in a tone that made it clear visiting again would be a waste of his time." Evelyn stared at her sister. "He left a card," Madeline said, holding it out. "He said the offer has a deadline, end of the month." Colton took the card, read it, handed it to Walt. "Good," Evelyn said. Madeline blinked. "Good. A deadline means he's nervous," Evelyn said. "A nervous man makes errors." She looked at her sister properly. "You did well, Maddie." Something moved across Madeline's face, surprise, and then something that wasn't quite pride, but was adjacent to it. The look of someone who had done something competent and been told so plainly and hadn't known how much they needed to hear it. "I was very polished," Madeline said. "The kind of polished that means the opposite of what it looks like." She paused. "I know that kind. I've spent my whole life around that kind." Evelyn nodded. "I know you have." "I want to help," Madeline said. "With whatever you're doing. I don't know the ranching side of it, but I know people. I know how they present themselves versus what they're actually doing. I've been studying that since I was 15. Evelyn looked at her for a long moment. Colton said nothing. Walt said nothing. Both of them understanding, she thought that this was not their conversation. "All right," Evelyn said. "I'll tell you everything tonight, and we'll figure out where you fit." Madeline nodded. She went back inside. Colton looked at Evelyn. "She's different," he said quietly. 2 weeks of managing a sick father and a house she doesn't know how to run will do that," Evelyn said. "So will watching her sister," Colton said. She didn't answer that, but she didn't dismiss it either. The thing she hadn't told any of them yet was the second piece she'd found. Not in her father's lockbox, she'd already laid that on the table. But in her own memory, in the slow accumulation of the past few days, in conversations half heard and details half noticed that had been rearranging themselves in the back of her mind while she focused on the more immediate crisis. She found it that night, sitting at the kitchen table after everyone had gone to bed. She had asked herself early on how Voss had known about her father's financial situation. The answer she'd given herself was that a man like Voss made it his business to know which landowners were underwater. That was true as far as it went. But there was a more specific answer. She pulled out the household ledger, not the one her father kept. The one she kept, the one she'd been maintaining for 5 years. She went back through it. The medical payments. The dates. The amounts. She cross-referenced them against the records in the family's public account at the Red Hollow Bank, which she had access to because she'd been managing it for 3 years. Someone had been making inquiries at the bank. Not Voss directly, someone on his behalf. The bank manager, a man named Chester Pruitt, who Evelyn had dealt with for years, had mentioned 6 months ago, casually, that there had been some interest from a Denver firm in local property values. He'd mentioned it as small talk. She'd filed it and moved on. Chester Pruitt had access to account information. Chester Pruitt was the kind of man who was always slightly too well dressed for his salary. Chester Pruitt had, now that she thought about it, been particularly solicitous toward her father over the past year in a way that had read as kindness at the time. She wrote his name at the top of a clean sheet of paper. Then she wrote Whitfield below it. Then Voss at the top with a line connecting them all. She looked at the diagram. Voss had not just been patient. He had been thorough. He had built a network of information, local people, local connections. People her father trusted to identify the exact right moment to move, which meant he had help in Red Hollow itself. She sat with that for a long time. Then she went and woke Colton. He answered his door fully awake, which told her he hadn't been asleep either. She handed him the sheet of paper without preamble. He looked at it for 30 seconds. Chester Pruitt, he said. He had access to the account records, she said. He would have known exactly when the savings started running low. And he's been... She described the solicitousness, the small-talk mention of Denver interest, the too good clothing. Colton looked at the diagram. If Pruitt is feeding Voss information about local finances, Voss isn't just targeting your father. He's targeting anyone whose account shows vulnerability. Which means we need to know who else Pruitt has been watching, she said. Jim Calloway, Colton said immediately. He mentioned a hard year last spring, said the bank had been helpful about extending his operating credit. He paused. Helpful banks aren't helpful for free. They looked at each other across the doorway in the dark. This is bigger than we thought 2 hours ago, Evelyn said. Yes, he said. We need a lawyer, she said. Not a Red Hollow lawyer, a Denver lawyer, or a Cheyenne lawyer, someone Voss doesn't have a line to. I know someone in Cheyenne, he said. Rode with his brother years back. He's straight. How fast can you reach him? Telegraph in the morning, he said. If he can ride out by the end of the week, we have our documentation ready before the month-end deadline. She nodded. He looked at her in the low light. This woman who had figured out in 2 hours what Voss had assumed nobody would ever piece together at all. Evelyn, he said. I know, she said. We handle it. That's not what I was going to say. She waited. I was going to say, are you all right? The question caught her off balance, which wasn't easy to do. She managed most things from behind a surface that didn't reveal what was happening underneath, and she managed it consistently and well. But that question asked plainly at midnight after the day she'd had it got through the surface. I don't know yet, she said honestly. My father kept something from me that I should have known. A man has been building a scheme that would have destroyed multiple families, and he was doing it for years, and nobody saw it. And she stopped. And, he said. And I almost missed it, she said. The letter was under everything else in the box. If I'd only looked at the top documents and been satisfied, I would have missed it completely. But you didn't, he said. But I almost did. Evelyn. He said her name quietly, precisely the way he said everything. Almost doesn't count in the direction you're applying it. You found it. You built the connection to Pruitt in one evening. You've organized 8 ranchers in one day. almost doesn't enter into it. She looked at him for a moment. I'm not accustomed to someone saying that to me, she said. I know, he said. Get accustomed to it. She almost smiled. Good night, Colton. Good night, Evelyn. She went back to her room and slept 4 hours and woke up ready. The telegram to Cheyenne went out at 7 in the morning. The response came back by noon, Daniel Marsh, attorney, arriving Thursday by train. Colton had described the situation in 12 words, because that was how telegrams worked, and Daniel Marsh's response had been 4 words. On my way. Bring documents. That was a good sign. What was not a good sign was what Walt found Wednesday morning. He came into the kitchen where Evelyn was going through the compiled documentation, every rancher's account of every contact with Whitfield or Voss, organized chronologically cross-referenced against the water rights geography, and he set a piece of paper on the table in front of her without saying anything first. It was a notice, filed with the Red Hollow County Recorder's Office. Dated 2 days ago, which meant Voss had filed it the morning after Whitfield's second visit, the one Madeline had turned away. It was a formal notice of intent to acquire water rights on the eastern Callaway Creek tributary, filed under a corporate name Evelyn had never heard. Clearwater Land and Resource Management, Denver, Colorado. Not Voss's name. Not Whitfield's name. A corporate name, which meant that even if they proved Voss's connection to the timber fraud and the Pruitt information feeding arrangement, the water rights acquisition was being handled through a separate legal entity. He had been more careful than she'd given him credit for. He filed this the morning after Whitfield was turned away, Walt said, which means he was already planning this in parallel. The visit to your father wasn't the only play. It was the visible play. This was the real move. Evelyn read this notice twice. What does this actually accomplish? She said. It's a notice of intent, not a completed transaction. The water rights still belong to my father. For now, Walt said. But if this notice goes unopposed, and your father then sells the rights even willingly, even at fair price, the transaction looks clean. The corporate name insulates Voss from the fraud connections. He doesn't need to force anything. He just needs your father to sell, and the rest disappears into paperwork. She sat with that for a long moment. He's not trying to steal it, she said slowly. He never was. He's been building circumstances that make selling feel like the reasonable choice. The debt pressure, the friendly bank manager, the generous offer, the deadline. He's been engineering inevitability. She looked up at Walt. He's not a thief. He's a stage manager. Walt nodded. And stage managers are harder to prosecute than thieves. Not impossible, she said. Harder. She picked up the notice and stood up. I need to see my father. Harold Pierce was sitting up in bed, which was progress. His color was better than it had been, and his eyes were clearer, and he looked at Evelyn when she came in with the alert attention of a man who has been lying still long enough that his mind had been working overtime. Evie, he said. Sit down. I want to talk to you. I want to talk to you too, she said. But you go first. He looked at her for a moment. I made a mistake, he said. Not just the letter, not just talking to Voss without telling you. The whole last 2 years. Every time I chose to handle something without you, because I didn't want you to see how bad it had gotten. He stopped. I've been so proud of what you've built in this house. So proud of how capable you are. And I let that become an excuse for not protecting you from things you should have known about. Because you would have handled them. And if you'd handled them, that meant I wasn't. He met her eyes. That was wrong, Evie. I chose my pride over your information. And you almost paid for it. Evelyn sat very still. Almost, she said. Almost, he agreed. Because you're smarter than my mistakes. She reached over and put her hand over his. His hands were steadier today than they'd been in weeks. The rest had done something real. Papa, she said, I need you to understand something. Tell me. Voss filed a formal notice of intent with the county recorder, she said. She watched his face while she said it. 2 days ago. It's through a corporate name, Clearwater something, but it's him. And it means that even with everything we're building against him, if you sign anything, any document, any agreement, it becomes significantly more complicated to unwind. Harold's jaw tightened. I won't sign anything. I need you to mean that even if someone comes to you directly, she said. Not Whitfield. If Voss comes himself. If he comes with papers and a pen and a number that sounds like it solves everything you send for me before you touch the pen. I promise you, he said. On your word, she said. On my word, he said. She nodded. The lawyer from Cheyenne arrives tomorrow, she said. His name is Daniel Marsh. He's going to need to talk to you. It'll be tiring. I'll manage, Harold said. You'll rest properly, and then you'll talk to him, she corrected. Not the other way around. He almost smiled. You sound like your mother, he said. It came out soft and a little surprised the way things do when memory arrives before you've planned for it. She squeezed his hand and left him to sleep. Daniel Marsh arrived on Thursday's train, and he was nothing like what Evelyn had expected, which was her own fault for expecting anything. He was younger than she'd imagined, 35 at the outside, slight and dark-haired, with the quick, darting attention of someone who processes information fast and trusts his first read. He shook her hand like he'd been shaking women's hands at business meetings his whole life and saw nothing unusual about it. He spent 2 hours with the documentation. He asked precise, rapid questions. He wrote things down in a cramped shorthand that only he could read. He did not tell them what he thought until he was finished, which took the full 2 hours, and then he sat back in his chair and said, The timber fraud is provable. The Pruitt connection is circumstantial, but worth pursuing if we can get Pruitt's correspondence with the Denver firm, which a subpoena would accomplish it, stops being circumstantial fast. The corporate shell for the water rights acquisition is legitimate, but Thin Clearwater was incorporated 6 weeks ago, which means Voss set it up specifically for this, which means there's a paper trail between him and it that a competent filing search will find. He looked at Evelyn. The notice of intent has a 60-day response window under territorial law. You're in week 1. You have time. What do we file? Colton asked. A formal objection to the notice of intent on the grounds of the pending fraud investigation, Marsh said, which freezes the acquisition process until the investigation is resolved. Simultaneously, we file a complaint with the Territorial Land Office regarding the timber accounting discrepancy that gets Voss's business practices on official record, which affects the credibility of any claim he makes about the water rights acquisition being a legitimate transaction. He paused. And we request Chester Pruitt's correspondence. The kitchen was quiet. How long does all this take? Walt said. The objection filing we do tomorrow, Marsh said. The complaint the same day. The subpoena for Pruitt's records, 2 weeks, maybe 3. He looked at Colton. I'll need to stay in Red Hollow while this is active. I assume there's somewhere I can work. There's a room, Evelyn said, and you'll eat well. Marsh almost smiled. Mercer said you were capable, he said. He understated it considerably. She looked at Colton. Colton looked at the wall mildly. I didn't want you to feel pressured. She filed that away to examine later. The filings went in on Friday. By Saturday, Red Hollow knew about them because Red Hollow always knew everything, and the specific thing it knew was that the Pierce family, backed by Colton Mercer and 8 other Valley ranchers and a Cheyenne attorney, had filed formal legal objections to a water rights acquisition attempt by a Denver corporate entity. By Sunday, Harlan Voss had sent a message. Not through Whitfield this time. Voss himself writing, addressed to Evelyn Pierce directly. He wrote, I believe there has been a misunderstanding about the nature of my interest in the Callaway Creek water rights. I would welcome the opportunity to discuss this directly with you and correct any misconceptions. I propose a meeting at a mutually convenient location. He did not mention Colton. He did not mention the other ranchers. He did not mention the lawyer. He addressed it to Evelyn, because he had finally belatedly correctly identified who was at the center of this. She read the letter at the kitchen table with Colton and Marsh and Walt and Madeline, who had insisted on being present and had turned out to have a genuinely useful ability to read tone in written correspondence, which was not a skill Evelyn had expected but was glad of. He's scared, Madeline said flatly. He's recalibrating, Evelyn said. Same thing, Madeline said. Marsh was reading the letter with his quick, dark attention. He's fishing, he said. He wants to know how much you have. A meeting gives him information without giving you any. I'd recommend declining in writing formally and stating that all communication from this point forward goes through my office." "Agreed," Colton said. "Agreed," Evelyn said. But she sat for a moment longer with the letter in her hand, looking at her own name on the outside of the envelope. Evelyn Pierce. Written in the careful handwriting of a man who had spent 2 years assuming she wasn't there, wasn't watching, wasn't the one who would unravel everything he'd built. A man who had looked right past her, the way everyone always had, until now. She set the letter down. "Draft the response," she told Marsh. "Make it clean." "Yes, ma'am," Marsh said. She stood up from this table. Colton was watching her with that particular attention he had, the kind that saw past surface to whatever was actually there. She met his eyes and held them for a moment. She thought about a woman in the dark in the mud resetting a wagon wheel while her sister laughed at a party inside their own house. She thought about 31 years of doing the necessary thing without applause, without credit, without anyone knowing her name. She thought about what Ruth Caldwell had said on a cold afternoon in a laundry house in Red Hollow. "Oh, you've been keeping pace your whole life, just not for yourself." She was keeping pace for herself now. And Harlan Voss was about to find out exactly what that meant. Daniel Marsh filed the formal response to Voss on Monday morning, and by Monday afternoon, Red Hollow had changed. Not dramatically. Not all at once. That was not how small towns changed. They changed the way ice changed in early spring. A hairline crack here, a slight softening there. And then one morning you stepped on what you thought was solid ground and found it had become something else entirely underneath you. The crack started at the bank. Chester Pruitt came to find Evelyn, which told her everything she needed to know about the state of Chester Pruitt's nerves. Men like Pruitt did not come to women like Evelyn. They summoned. They sent word. They waited to be visited because waiting to be visited was a form of power, and men like Pruitt collected forms of power, the way other men collected land. The fact that he appeared at the Pierce front door on Monday evening with his hat in his hands and a careful expression that was working very hard to look like nothing in particular, that was the tell. Evelyn let him in. She did not offer him coffee. "Miss Pierce," he said, sitting across from her at the kitchen table. "I think there may have been some confusion about my involvement in certain business matters." "What confusion?" she said. The correspondence that may have passed through my office regarding property interests in the valley." He was choosing words the way a man chooses footing on a bad trail, slowly testing each one before he put his weight on it. "I want to be clear that my role was purely informational. I provided no privileged client information. I simply described general financial trends in the region to a Denver firm that was paying you for exactly that information," Evelyn said. Pruitt went still. "I know what you did," she said. "Our lawyer knows what you did. What I'm interested in knowing is how much you knew about what Voss intended to do with it." I wasn't aware of the full Chester." She said his name the way she said the names of things she intended to handle. "I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I want a direct answer, because the answer determines whether your name appears in the territorial complaint as a co-conspirator or as a witness who cooperated. Those are different positions with different consequences. Do you understand the difference?" He understood. She could see him understand, the color moving in his face. "Yes," he said. "Did Voss tell you explicitly what he intended to do with the water rights?" A long pause. He said he was building a land and water management portfolio," Pruitt said. "He said it would be beneficial for regional development." "But you understood what controlling those water rights would mean for the ranchers in this valley." Another pause, shorter. "Yes," he said. "And you provided the information anyway." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. She thought about her father's shaking hands. She thought about 2 years of careful erosion patient and quiet targeting men who were already struggling. She thought about the way Voss had engineered inevitability and called it business. "Here's what you're going to do," she said. "You're going to write down everything, every conversation with Voss or his representatives, every piece of information you passed and when and how, every payment you received. You're going to give that document to Daniel Marsh by Wednesday morning. She paused. And then you're going to recuse yourself from any bank decisions involving Valley property or water rights for as long as this matter is before the courts. If you do those things, your name stays on the witness side of the ledger. Pruitt sat across from her, looking like a man who had expected this to go differently and was now adjusting his entire understanding of who he'd been dealing with. You're very certain about all of this, he said. I am, she said. How long have you known? Long enough, she said. Will you do it? He looked at his hat in his hands. Yes, he said. After he left, Evelyn sat alone at the kitchen table for 3 minutes and let her hands shake because they'd wanted to shake the entire time, and she'd refused them, and now she gave them their 3 minutes. Then she folded them flat on the table and went to find Marsh, who was in the room they'd given him surrounded by papers, and when she told him about Pruitt, he set down his pen and looked at her with the expression she was beginning to recognize as his version of surprise, a slight raising of one eyebrow quickly controlled. He came to you, Marsh said. Yes. You handled it correctly, he said. Witness side of the ledger was exactly right. His testimony corroborates the paper trail and gives us a human voice behind the documents which juries respond to better than they respond to accounting records. He picked his pen back up. Voss is going to know about this by tomorrow. Good, she said. He'll move, Marsh said. When a plan starts coming apart, men like Voss move fast in one of two directions. They either fold or they escalate. Which do you think he'll do? Marsh considered. He's been patient and methodical for 2 years, he said. Methodical men don't fold easily. They escalate. He looked at her. I want you to be prepared for that. She was prepared for it. She just didn't know yet what form it would take. She found out Thursday. Walt brought the news in from the feed store where he'd been picking up supplies, and he came into the kitchen with the particular expression he wore when information required careful delivery. Voss is in town, he said. Not Whitfield. Voss himself. Evelyn set down what she was doing. Where? He took a room at the inn last night, Walt said. He's been at the land recorder's office this morning, and he had a meeting with Judge Farrow this afternoon. Judge Farrow. Evelyn turned that over. Owen Farrow had been the county judge for 11 years. He was a decent man by most measures, but he had also been appointed originally through the recommendation of the Denver Land Bureau, and Denver Land Bureau appointments had a way of reflecting Denver Land Bureau interests. What kind of meeting? She said. Nobody knows what was said. But Farrow's clerk told the feed store clerk that there was some kind of discussion about expedited review of the water rights notice of intent. Walt looked at her. If Farrow fast-tracks the review and rules in Voss's favor before our objections are fully processed. He can't, Marsh said from the doorway. He'd heard enough. The territorial statute requires a minimum 30-day objection review period regardless of the judge's preference. Farrow knows that. Whatever Voss is asking him for, it isn't that. Then what is it? Colton said. He'd come in behind Marsh, and his voice had that cold, quiet quality it got when he was most focused. Could be a ruling on the validity of our objection itself, Marsh said. If Farrow declares our filing procedurally defective, even on a technicality, it removes the freeze on the acquisition process. Voss then moves fast before we can refile. Is our filing procedurally solid? Evelyn asked. Airtight, Marsh said. I don't make procedural errors. He said it without arrogance, just as act, the way Walt would state that a fence was built correctly. But a judge who wants to find a defect can sometimes find one. The kitchen went quiet. Colton said, Is Farrow that kind of judge? Marsh was quiet for a moment. I don't know yet, he said. I'm going to find out. He left to find out. He came back 2 hours later and sat at the kitchen table with his careful, quick eyes moving over something internal. Farrow is not corrupt, he said, but he's under pressure. Voss apparently suggested that the water rights acquisition would bring significant investment to the region. And Farrow is the kind of man who cares about regional development in a genuine way that a sufficiently sophisticated argument can exploit. He looked at Evelyn. He's hearing arguments on the procedural validity of our objection filing tomorrow morning. Both sides. Which means we present tomorrow morning. What do we need? Evelyn said. I need to be there, Marsh said. I need the documentation package organized by the specific statutory provisions our objection rests on which I can do tonight. And I need, he paused, I need the ranchers, not as legal parties, as presents. I need Pharaoh to see that this is not an abstract property dispute. It's 8 families and their livelihoods. I'll get them, Evelyn said. She sent word that evening. Frank Dolan sent word back within the hour he'd be there. So would Hector Reyes. Jim Calloway sent word that he was bringing his brother. By morning she had 7 of the 8, the 8th being down with a bad cough but represented by his eldest son, which was arguably better because the eldest son was 22 and angry in the specific clear-eyed way of a young man who understood exactly what was at stake and had not yet learned to soften it. They filled the left side of Judge Pharaoh's courtroom. Voss sat on the right side with Whitfield and a lawyer. Evelyn hadn't seen before, older from the look of him, expensive, brought in from somewhere that wasn't Red Hollow. He looked at the assembled ranchers on the left side with the expression of a man recalculating a risk assessment. Voss himself looked at Evelyn. She had expected that. She looked back. She did not look away, and she did not soften it, and she gave him nothing. How was a large man, well-dressed with the kind of face that had probably been charming once, and had calcified over the years into something that looked like authority, but was actually just certainty. The certainty of a man who had always gotten what he wanted by being patient and thorough and underestimating the people in his way. He had underestimated her. She was going to make sure he understood that clearly before this was over. Judge Pharaoh was a gray-haired man with careful eyes who came in and settled himself and looked at both sides of his courtroom with the expression of a man who had heard a great many things in this room and intended to hear this thing properly. Voss's lawyer argued first. He was smooth. He argued that the Pierce family's objection filing, while technically within the response window, relied on allegations of fraud that were unsubstantiated, and that using an unsubstantiated fraud claim to freeze a legitimate business transaction was an improper use of the objection mechanism. He used the phrase improper use 4 times. He was good. Marsh argued second. He was better. He laid out the timber accounting discrepancy with numbers. He laid out the corporate structure of Clearwater Land and Resource Management and the 6-week-old incorporation date with documents. He laid out the coordinated approach to multiple landowners across a 2-year period with testimony summaries. He laid out Pruitt's statement, which Pruitt had delivered Wednesday morning as promised, with the particular weight of a local man confessing to local damage. And then he said something that Evelyn had not expected. "Your Honor," he said, "I'd like to call a brief witness, not a legal party, a fact witness." He called Evelyn. She had not known he was going to do this. She looked at him when he said her name, and he gave her a look that said, "Trust me." And she decided to trust him because she had decided to trust him, and she was going to follow through on that decision. She stood up. She walked to the front of the room. She faced Judge Pharaoh. "Miss Pierce," Marsh said, "please tell the court what you found in your father's document box on the evening of November 14th. She told it. Not dramatically. Not with any performance of emotion. She told it the way she told everything, precisely, completely, in the correct order, with the relevant details, and without the irrelevant ones. She described the letter. She described what it contained. She described what it implied about the timeline of Voss's approach to her father. She described her father's medical situation and the debt that had accumulated and the shame that had kept it hidden, and she said that last part plainly and without softening it because it was true, and Judge Pharaoh needed to hear what kind of man built a scheme on another man's shame. When she finished, the courtroom was quiet. Judge Pharaoh looked at her for a long moment. "Miss Pierce," he said, "you organized this legal response." "In partnership with Mr. Mercer and Mr. Marsh," she said. "Yes, sir." "And the ranchers present today, you contacted them?" "Yes, sir." He looked at the left side of the room. 7 men and 1 young man, all of them watching him with the particular attention of people whose livelihoods were in the room. He looked at the right side. He looked at Voss. Voss met his gaze with the steady confidence of a man who had calculated his odds and still liked them. Judge Pharaoh looked back at his papers. "The objection filing stands," he said. The allegations contained therein are sufficiently substantiated to warrant the objection review proceeding in full. The Clearwater Notice of Intent remains frozen pending resolution of the fraud inquiry. He looked at Voss's lawyer. Counsel, I'd recommend advising your client that expediting this matter is no longer in his interest. He stood. Everyone stood. It was over. It was not, of course, actually over. Legal things were never over in a single moment. But that ruling was the hinge, the point where Voss's careful 2-year construction cracked along its load-bearing wall, and everything he had built on the assumption that nobody was watching began to come apart. Outside the courthouse, Frank Dolan shook Evelyn's hand. Then he shook it again harder, the way men shake hands when they mean something they don't know how to say. Your father raised you right, he said. My father raised me the best he could, she said. I raised the rest myself. Frank Dolan looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once, which from Frank Dolan was its own complete sentence. Colton was waiting at the bottom of the courthouse steps. He had not been in the room. He'd stayed outside by his own choice, she understood, because the inside needed to be her space to fill, without his presence changing the shape of it. He stood in the cold with his hat in his hands, and he looked at her face when she came down the steps and read it correctly. Done, he said. The first part, she said. The hard part, he said. She came to stand beside him, not in front, not behind, beside. Marsh thinks the full inquiry will take 6 to 8 weeks. Voss will likely settle rather than face a full fraud ruling on his business record. He will, Colton said. He's a businessman. Businessmen calculate. When the calculation turns, they turn. And the water rights. Stay where they are, he said. With your family, where they belong. She looked at him. The cold was sharp and bright, and she could see her breath and his breath mixing in the air between them. I need to talk to you, she said. I know, he said. I've been thinking about it for 2 weeks, and I've been putting it off because there was always something more immediate to handle, and She stopped. I'm better at immediate things than I am at the other kind. The other kind, he said. Future things, she said. Things that haven't happened yet. Things that might happen. I don't plan well for those. I plan for what's in front of me. Evelyn, he said. I'm trying to say something, she said. I know, he said. I'm listening. She looked at him. At this man who had ridden into Red Hollow on a dark horse in November and looked past everything everyone pointed him toward and found her in the mud, resetting a wagon wheel in the dark. This man who had sat across from her at a kitchen table and told her he was lonely, which was the most honest thing she'd ever heard a man say about himself. This man who had ridden 60 miles in cold weather to stand beside her and then stayed and then kept staying, not because she needed him to, but because he wanted to. I'm coming back to the ridge, she said. He went very still. Marsh can handle the legal process from Red Hollow. He doesn't need me hovering over his shoulder, and he'd probably prefer I didn't. My father is stable. His heart is better with rest and the right management. And Madeline? She paused. Madeline is not me. She will never run a household the way I run a household. But she is capable of more than either of us gave her credit for, and she's been proving that for 2 weeks, and she deserves the chance to prove it for real. What are you saying exactly? He said. I'm saying I spent 31 years being necessary, she said. Being the one who stayed because someone had to. Being the one who managed because no one else would. And I told myself that was enough. That purpose was enough. That usefulness was enough. She met his eyes. And then you showed me what it felt like to be chosen. Not needed. Chosen. And I'm not willing to give that back. Colton looked at her for a long time. Evelyn, he said, I have something to say, and I need you to let me finish it. All right, she said. I have been running Mercer Ridge for 3 years, he said. And it has been running well. The cattle are healthy. The accounts balance, the hands are loyal. The fences are solid. By every practical measure, the ranch is successful. He paused. And I come home every evening to a house that has everything in it except the thing that makes it matter. I told you that once. I told you I was lonely. And that was true. He took a slow breath. But it's more than lonely. I built that place for a life. A whole life with another person at the center of it. And I've been running it like an operation, because that was all I knew how to do after Clara, and operations don't need... He stopped. They don't need what I've been missing. She waited. You came to my ridge for a week, he said. And in that week, you reorganized my supply system, caught 2 years of timber fraud one, Della the mayor, and Walt Greer and Pete, who has now apparently decided you hung the moon. He paused. And you sat at my kitchen table at midnight in a storm, and told me that you thought you needed what my place was. Do you remember that? I remember, she said. I've been thinking about that for 2 weeks, he said. What you needed, what I needed, what this could be. He looked at her. Come back to the ridge, not for a week, not for a month. Come back and build it with me. Be my partner in every sense of that word. Not the business arrangement I described to your father. The real thing. The whole thing. He paused once more, and this pause was different from the others. It had something in it that looked on this weathered and careful face very much like a man stepping off solid ground, because something on the other side was worth the risk. He reached into his coat pocket. He brought out something small and set it on his palm between them. It was a ring. Simple gold, plain and clean, the kind of ring made for a working hand. I had this made in Cheyenne, he said. When I sent the telegram to Marsh, I want you to know that I wasn't certain you'd say yes. I'm still not certain you'll say yes. But I was certain enough that I wanted to have it ready if you did. Evelyn looked at the ring on his palm. She looked at his face. She thought about every woman who had ever stood in this particular moment, in this particular story. This moment, where everything that has been invisible becomes visible, where everything quiet becomes loud, where the woman who was never supposed to be chosen stands in front of the person who chose her anyway and decides what to do with that. She had spent 31 years deciding. Every morning, every frozen dawn, every late night with a ledger and a low lamp. Every time she set a wagon wheel in the mud, or calmed a frightened horse, or wrote out another man's letters because his hands shook too badly. She had always known how to decide. Yes, she said. Colton put the ring on her finger with hands that were not entirely steady, which was the most human thing she had ever seen him do. She left them unsteady. She didn't look away from his face. All right, he said quietly. All right. Right, she said back. They stood there on the courthouse steps in the cold Wyoming morning, and neither of them made a performance of it. And that was exactly right, because they were not people who made performances. They were people who did things and meant them. The town saw, of course. The town always saw everything. Mrs. Whitmore saw from across the street and turned to say something to the woman standing beside her, and the woman beside her was already watching. And within an hour, Red Hollow knew that Evelyn Pierce had walked out of the courthouse with the water rights inquiry won and Colton Mercer's ring on her finger. The reactions were what you'd expect from a town that had spent years arranging Evelyn Pierce into the background, and now found itself needing to rewrite its understanding of the foreground. Some people were surprised. Some people claimed they'd always known. Some people were gracious, and some people were not, and Evelyn did not spend significant time on the ones who were not, because she had better things to do with her time, and always had. Madeline was waiting at the house. She looked at Evelyn's left hand when she came through the door. She looked for a long time, and then she looked at her sister's face, and something moved through her expression that was complicated and real and not entirely simple. Love and loss and pride, and the particular grief of someone who has had to revise everything they thought they understood about their own life and their own value. You said yes, Madeline said. I said yes, Evelyn said. Madeline crossed the kitchen and hugged her. Not the careful, managed embrace of a woman who was performing warmth. A real hug, the kind that costs something, the kind that says, I am genuinely glad, even though it is also genuinely hard. You deserve it, Madeline said into her shoulder. I don't say that the way people say it when they mean something smaller. I mean you actually deserve it. You built this Evie. You built all of it. This whole family runs on what you built. Evelyn held her sister for a moment. So do you? She said. You kept this house for 2 weeks. You turned away Whitfield twice. You sat in the kitchen at night figuring out the supply ledger because you were too proud to leave it wrong. Madeline pulled back. You knew about that. I saw the corrections in the morning, Evelyn said. Your handwriting is recognizable." Madeline almost laughed. Her eyes were bright, and she controlled it with the dignity of a woman who had decided to stop performing composure and start actually having some. "I did it wrong 3 times before I got it right," she said. "That's how you get it right?" Evelyn said. Their father was sitting up in the armchair when Evelyn went to him, because Harold Pierce had decided that the armchair was a reasonable compromise between the bed his daughter insisted on and the full activity his own instincts demanded. He looked at her hand. He looked at her face. His eyes went soft in a way that aging had made possible for him. He had been a harder man when he was younger, and illness and time had stripped away enough of the hardness to leave something truer underneath. "He asked you," Harold said. "He did," she said. "And you said yes." "I said yes, Papa." He reached out and took her hand, the hand with the ring, and held it in both of his. His hands were steadier than they'd been. The rest was working. The absence of worry was working. "Your mother would have—" He stopped, cleared his throat, started again. "She would have said it was about time." Evelyn sat on the footstool beside his chair, the way she had since she was small. "How are you?" she said. "Not what you tell the doctor. How are you really?" "Better," he said. And then, because she was waiting, because she always waited for the real answer, "Better than I expected to be. Better than I deserve, probably." "Stop that," she said. "I mean it, Evie. I made mistakes. I've been trying to figure out how to—" "Papa." She kept hold of his hand. "You did the best you knew how. You failed sometimes, and you did well sometimes, and you were prouder than you should have been, and more afraid than you showed. That's being a person. I'm not carrying the mistakes. I'm carrying the hand you're holding right now." He was quiet for a moment. "That man is going to take good care of you," Harold said. "We're going to take good care of each other," she corrected. Harold almost smiled. "That's better," he said. "That's the right way to say it." Marsh resolved the legal matter faster than anyone expected, which he attributed to Voss's decision to settle rather than face a full fraud ruling. The settlement came in week 5, not week 6 or 8. The terms were straightforward. Clearwater's notice of intent was formally withdrawn. The water rights remained with the Pierce family in perpetuity, and Voss's timber business in the region was required to reprocess 2 years of measurements and issue corrective payments to every affected operation, Mercer Ridge included. The corrective payment to Mercer Ridge was substantial. Evelyn put it in the account she was now managing alongside Colton's foreman, because she was already back on the ridge by then, had been for 3 weeks living in the main house, not as a guest, but as a partner, which was exactly what she had asked for and exactly what she had been given. Marsh sent her a letter from Cheyenne after it was concluded. It said, "It was an honor, Miss Pierce, or Mrs. Mercer to be, I suppose. I've handled 47 cases in this territory. This was the one. D. Marsh." She kept the letter in the document box, next to the water rights survey and the Pierce family deed. Walt Greer gave her a wedding gift 3 weeks before the ceremony. He appeared at the main house with a piece of paper rolled into a tube and handed it to her without ceremony. It was the corrected herd count records, going back 6 full years, rebuilt from every source he could find, every scrap and note and seasonal record, organized exactly the way she had described wanting them organized on her first night at the ranch. "I figured you'd want to know what you were actually starting with," he said. She looked at the records. They were meticulous. The gaps were filled. The numbers were real. "Walt," she said. "Ma'am," he said. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once and went back to work. Pete, who was 17 and had decided to learn everything he possibly could from watching Evelyn work, asked her the morning of the wedding, which was a simple affair at the Red Hollow Church, plain and honest, and attended by 8 ranching families, and Ruth Caldwell and Madeline Pierce in a blue dress, and Harold Pierce in his best coat, standing up straight under his own power, because he had decided he was well enough to stand for his own daughter's wedding, and the doctor had been informed of this decision and had wisely decided not to argue. Pete asked her while she was checking on Della, the mare, one final time before she went inside to get ready. "Are you scared?" She thought about it honestly because Pete deserved honest answers. "No," she said. "I've been scared of things my whole life. Scared of being invisible. Scared of being wrong. scared of wanting something and being told I wasn't the right kind of woman to have it. She checked Della's leg, healed clean, no heat, the mare dancing lightly on the fresh straw. I'm not scared today. Today I just feel like myself, fully, without the parts I've been keeping quiet. Pete thought about this. That sounds good, he said. It is, she said. She walked into her wedding like a woman who knew where she was going because she had always known where she was going. She had just spent 31 years being told the destination wasn't meant for her. She stood at the front of that plain church in Red Hollow, Wyoming, and she looked at the man across from her. This weathered, serious, careful man who had ridden into her life on a dark horse in November, and looked past everything he was supposed to see, and found her. And she understood something she would spend the rest of her life knowing. She had not been waiting to be chosen. She had been waiting to choose. And she had chosen. She had chosen to come off that porch and reset the wagon in the dark. She had chosen to write the note and ride up the mountain. She had chosen to find the letter and read it twice and build the response from nothing at a kitchen table at midnight. She had chosen to stand in front of Judge Farrow and tell the truth plainly and without performance. She had chosen yes on the courthouse steps with the cold Wyoming air sharp around them and the ring warm in his hand. Every part of this life she had built. Every part of it. The minister said words that had been said in that church for 30 years. The good old words about partnership and endurance and love that doesn't require a performance. And when he reached the end of them, Colton Mercer looked at her with those steady accounting eyes and said, I do. And Evelyn Pierce looked back at him with everything she was, the capable hands and the strong back, and the mind that caught what other people missed, and the heart she'd kept quiet for too long, and said, I do. And she meant it the way she meant everything. Completely. Without apology. Without reservation. Without looking back. That was how the woman, nobody had seen the woman in the mud in the dark behind the house, while her sister laughed at a party, became the woman standing at the center of everything she had built, wearing a plain gold ring on a working hand, standing beside a man who had known her worth before she'd fully claimed it herself. Not because someone rescued her. Not because the world changed its mind about what kind of woman deserved to be chosen. But because Evelyn Pierce had finally completely with all of herself, and nothing held back, chosen herself first, and everything else had simply followed.